Hi, everyone. Welcome to Therapy Talk. You know, in a number of our episodes prior to this, we've talked a lot about family therapy, and we've actually talked about some of the theories that we cover in our marriage and family therapy courses here at Columbus State University in our nationally accredited program. So today we're going to look more at a particular family therapy theory, and I've invited one of our students, Dan Hardin, who's going to come in and talk about internal family systems. And so this is kind of a special therapy talk today, so we're going to highlight one theory and let Dan tell us a little bit about that. He spent some time doing some research and some work in this, has some experience with it, and he's also in his internship here at Columbus State University at the Family Life Center at Fort Benning. So we're happy to have you here today, Dan. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dr. Baltimore.
Well, it's really our pleasure to have you here. I want to talk about this internal family system model that you brought to us today. I know we have some slides. We want to take people through a number of questions and some ideas, and maybe provide information for our viewers about this particular family systems model. So, can you tell us what internal family systems is all about? Give us an overview of this.
Sure, happy to. Internal family systems, also known as IFS, seeks to apply systems thinking and family systems theory towards interpsychic processes in an attempt to understand the types of interactions of the subpersonalities within the individual, but more importantly, their interaction with the larger systems that they find themselves in, such as their family or in a marriage.
Okay, so it almost sounds like there's some psychodynamic processing, maybe object relations, but certainly some of those internal processes, as you say. So tell us more.
Well, sure. Yeah. This was developed in the 1980s by Dr. Richard Schwartz, and he's out of Chicago, and he was raised in family systems therapy, in structural, strategic, and in object relations.
Okay. As many people are when they come into family systems.
Absolutely. Yeah. And he was performing some research with some families that had members who were bulimic. And as he was interviewing these members of these families, he found out that a lot of them kept on talking about, well, part of me feels like this, but another part of me feels like that. And over time, he began to notice through interaction with his clients that his clients naturally spoke about how different parts within themselves seemed to be in a polarity and causing difficulty. And when he would tend to those parts and get the individual to tend to those parts, he found that healing naturally came.
Okay, so they're really attending to what's going on within them. And so you said parts. So tell us more about that idea.
Absolutely. Parts, or what Schwartz would call subpersonalities within an individual, are basically good things that we've had with us since birth, and often those parts get off course due to trauma. And so traumatic events force these parts into extreme roles. And Schwartz defines two broad categories of parts. There's those parts that we all have that hold the sensations and the feelings, things that we'd rather forget from the traumatic events in our lives, and he calls those parts the exiled parts. And those are wounds, and they tend to be burdened and locked away. Those are the things that we bury deep within ourselves.
You know, one of the first things I'm hearing here, Dan, is that this is almost a natural process for people to talk about using that language. There's a part of me that feels this way. There's a part of me that feels another way.
Yeah, we do it all the time. And so Schwartz found that a lot of people naturally talk about their internal world this way. And oftentimes problem comes into families, into relationships when we interact with each other from these parts, sometimes without even thinking about it.
Right.
So one category would be these exiled and wounded parts.
Okay, so those are the things that we really have had an emotional reaction to, or a problem in our life, the difficulties in our life, and we tend to kind of push those away or compartmentalize, if you will, in that way.
Correct. In object relations, those would be like the bad objects, bad memories, things that we would project. Bowenian theory, that could be areas where we're undifferentiated, and when that part gets activated, we tend to react out of it emotionally. So the other category of parts he calls the protector parts.
Okay.
And the protector parts, their job is to protect the exiles. So if something's happening in the external world or in the family or in the marriage and the exile's getting upset, the protector's job is to keep keep the exiled parts happy and not excited. And he has two categories of protector parts. The first category is kind of like the defensive and protective protectors. Those would be what we call the managers. Managers kind of keep up appearances. They try to avoid pain and keep the exiles from getting upset. And so how this might look with an individual might be workaholism or perfectionism or performance-oriented mentalities and how they operate with their external world.
Okay.
The final category of protective parts that Schwartz defines are what he calls the firefighters. And the firefighters are those impulsive, reactionary parts, and their job is to rush in when an exile is upset and disturbed and to put out the emotional fire. And oftentimes, firefighters, like real-world firefighters, when they go to put out the fire, end up causing more damage to the larger system. So this might look like drug addictions, alcohol addictions, sexual addictions, or anything that's an excessive destructive behavior in an attempt to soothe pain.
Well, we may talk about this more in just a moment, but it sounds like just at the beginning that there's some need for integration or the client and the client family to understand how these parts work together, and then maybe do some work on those individual parts and relative to their goals and therapy.
Yeah, absolutely. For most people, we shift in and out of these parts really unconsciously.
Right.
And depending on what's going around in our lives and what's happening, some of these parts will hop into what Schwartz calls the seat of our consciousness and just kind of take control. And that's where it's difficult because those parts are trying to defend and protect, and they're more concerned about not disturbing exiles or appeasing and calming down exiles than they are with the health of the external relationship.
Right. So some of those parts are just play a larger role in terms of dealing with the stress in our lives.
Yeah, their intent is good. They want to protect the system. They're trying to help, but they end up not doing a good job at that.
Right.
And all that's very fascinating. But I think if Schwartz were here, he would say that the most interesting part of internal family systems is the concept of the self and self-leadership. And he doesn't look at the self as a part. Schwartz would define the self as who you really are at your core, or the word he would use is the closest way to understand the self is really our soul. It's the core of a person, and that soul is characterized by being calm, curious about the world around us, compassionate, courageous, and several other C words like creative and connected. And so the goal of IFS is to have the self leading the internal system and to operate with the external world from the self rather than these managers.
Okay. So too many managers may be problematic for a person. They may butt heads together. Too many...
Well, often managers do develop polarities. For example, if one of the managers is a drive for perfectionism, trying to keep up appearances and make the self and the system feel better about itself by being perfect, if they fail, then another manager rise up, and that's that critical manager that says, you didn't do good enough, you didn't try hard enough. And this causes an interaction internally between managers, and it diminishes the self.
Okay.
And so if a spouse or a family member kind of comes in on that, then it's going to cause some we're going to have a fight tonight.
Right. There's going to be some conflict
That's
to
right.
deal with. Well, now, how does this IFS theory look at psychopathology? How does it fit into the larger picture with that?
Well, it's interesting. We talk about multiple parts and the multiplicity and the multifaceted nature of our internal world. It almost sounds like multiple personality disorder, and it's not. Everyone has multiple parts, and like I said, these parts are good, but when the parts take on extreme roles and they begin to isolate from the system and become polarized, and parts begin to take over in a more dramatic way, then that person's self is less and less in charge, and you're now operating more from an emotional state rather than a healthier state.
Right. Okay. Well, that makes sense. Now, let's talk about the role of the therapist for just a moment. What is the role of the therapist in this, and how does this person operate, say, in a session? What's expected of the therapist?
Sure, sure. Ultimately, the role of the therapist is to facilitate more self-to-self interaction. So probably more than anything else, like most therapies, mindfulness is important. Mindfulness and staying in self for the therapist is the most important thing. Stay calm, stay curious, stay compassionate. Apart from that, as you interview the client, the therapist's role is to listen to and detect parts and point those out to the client, and to encourage the client to speak about the part, for the part, rather than from the part.
Okay. So really recognizing that. So I think or I'm guessing that's a part of the healing process, is that interaction with the therapist, the client, around those parts and focusing on it.
It's the initial steps of the healing journey. In order to empower the self and for the self to take on a larger role in leading the system and to produce an environment of more health for the external system that the client finds themselves in, the way to do that is to get to know the internal parts, right, and to build a trusting relationship and have those parts trust that the self is capable of leading the system,
right,
that the self cares about those parts, and that the self is going to help the exiles and the managers to unburden the emotional trauma that they carry.
Okay. All right, now, we've been talking about family systems therapy, and of course we've talked on this show about individual and family systems therapies, and sometimes it's difficult to really discern which is which in some cases, and I'm wondering if this sounds a little bit more like an individual therapy with, as you talked about, with the person having parts. That sounds like individual therapy. How does it work with couples and families?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, certainly we are looking in the intrapsychic world of the individual, but more importantly, it's how that person is interacting with the larger system in which they find themselves. And if that person can begin to discover, hey, I'm interacting more with my child or my mate from a manager or a firefighter or from an exiled or wounded part than I am my true self,
right, okay,
then they can be empowered to interact with their mate or their family member from a place of more calm and curious state.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so the therapist's job is to attend and encourage the self-to-self interactions within the family, and to point out when they slip into operating from managers and firefighters.
Okay. All right, so that brings in the other people in the family. That makes it more of a system arrangement, system kind of work there. Tell me a little bit I want to ask you about resources in just a moment, and where people who are watching can go get more information
mm-hmm.
about IFS. But just tell me, I know you're interested in this, but are there where does this interest come from? Tell me a little bit about why you think this theory is an important theory for us to take a look at here.
Well, for me, it makes sense. It's I've personally benefited from IFS therapy. Coming back from my deployment in Iraq and experiencing combat trauma myself,
mm-hmm.
I just came back with some difficulties and was having a hard time compartmentalizing and making sense of my experience. And it was through the help of someone who is trained in IFS to facilitate an inner healing experience that I could make sense of what was going on in my internal world, and more importantly, how that was affecting my external world.
Right.
And it was able to position me for healing and to provide some self-leadership and care and nurture for those wounded parts inside of me coming back from combat.
Excellent. Well, thank you for sharing that with us today, Dan. Now, if our viewers and others want to find out more about this particular therapy model, this family systems model, this internal family systems approach, can you talk about some of the resources and give us some ideas about where they might go?
Absolutely. The best place that I'd recommend for someone wanting to learn more about IFS is to go to their website. Okay. It's selfleadership.org, www.selfleadership.org. there you'll find all kinds of information about IFS. They have free telephone conferences from the developer, Richard Schwartz, coming up. I think the next one's in January. You can sign up and register for that. And there's also a bookstore. There's a couple resources that I think are very valuable. Internal Family Systems Therapy, the book by Richard Schwartz. And then a very practical primer for therapy written by Dr. Jay Earley called Self-Therapy. And even the title is interesting in that it's therapy for yourself, your true self. And it's also a primer to help someone easily learn how to do IFS with themselves. And it becomes a good tool for therapists interested in how to use some of the techniques within IFS in a clinical setting.
Well, excellent. Those sounds like great resources for us to further our knowledge about this particular model. Well, Dan, I want to thank you for taking the time to come in and talk with us here on Therapy Talk about internal family systems and sharing your knowledge and ideas about this particular model. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in to Therapy Talk. It's a show really about all the things that go on in therapy, and we want to talk about them. So, again, thank you, Dan Hardin, for coming in today, and we'll see you next time on Therapy Talk.